Hello guys, so I decided to do this video because one of my favorite YouTubers, Notes Reviews, does a very similar style of video with his own channel. Now, Notes Reviews is a guy from Toronto who reviews progressive rock, progressive metal, and various other forms of progressive music on his YouTube channel, and I thought it'd be kind of neat to do a video in his style. Obviously, I'm not going to do it justice to his style, but this is actually kind of a neat thing because the band that I'm doing this for is actually the band that introduced me to his channel. I caught their show last February. He was there as well. He did a review of that show, and I discovered that he was the guy that was standing next to me at the show. So that was just a really cool coincidence. And the style of this video is ranking a band's albums from worst to best. This band is a band that many people will know is very important and special to me. A band that has transcended just being a favorite band for me. There was a while where this band was practically my religion, and that band is Pain of Salvation. So starting off, it's kind of difficult to really say an album is the worst or the best without drawing some ire from the Pain of Salvation fan community, because I find that Pain of Salvation fans, more so than a lot of other bands' fan bases, has a tendency to be very particular and very vocal about their opinions. So, disclaimer, this is all just my own opinion. This is not meant to be a definitive, final list of the worst album to best. These are just the ones that I feel are probably most deserving of being put in that context. So I'm going to start off this list with an album that a lot of people did seem to agree was maybe the band's low point, and that is Road Salt 1. Now, this is not a bad album, and I need to really state that for all of the albums in the lower end of Pain of Salvation's quality list. Pain of Salvation has never released a truly terrible record. But Road Salt 1 is maybe a little too strong with its 70s prog rock connection. There are a few tracks that feel a little contrived, like they're trying to be something that Pain of Salvation never really was, like She Likes to Hide and Tell Me You Don't Know being more just straightforward standard blues rock songs, which is not really something I've ever associated with the band. As well, reading the liner notes for Road Salt 1 kind of reveals that the album seems to come off less as a Pain of Salvation record and more of a Daniel Gildenlow solo record, with several of the songs featuring solely his performances. The rest of the band almost seems like a bit of an afterthought on the record. Next worst on the list is Road Salt 2. Now, from Road Salt 1 to Road Salt 2, there's actually a pretty big jump in quality. I find that Road Salt 2 is the vastly superior of the two Road Salt records, and it seems to go in a direction that's very much like the first Road Salt 1 with the sort of blues rock, 70s prog worship, but it takes it in a direction that's maybe a little bit more familiar to Pain of Salvation fans, with some actually pretty epic tracks like The Physics of Gridlock, some very proggy tracks like The Deeper Cut, and there are a few sort of interesting little bits on the album, like the folky Healing Now, and To the Shoreline, which to me is like the perfect pop song. It's a wonder that this song didn't become a hit. And yeah, there are a couple of songs where it seems that the more mainstream direction of Pain of Salvation has actually kind of played in their favor a bit, like the track 1979, which is just a breathtaking song. So it is a much better album, but it still kind of suffers from some of the same issues that Road Salt 1 had. There are a few tracks that feel a little like Daniel Gildenlow solo tracks, and sometimes it doesn't really feel like it gels the way a Pain of Salvation record has. Probably owing to the fact that neither of the Road Salt albums are narrative lyrical concepts like the vast majority of Pain of Salvation's records. So they do feel a little disconnected, maybe not something that the listener's really going to sit down and sink their teeth into. Next on the list is actually not an album. It's more like a series of kind of albums, EPs, and I wanted to reserve a spot for these sort of special releases that don't really fit into a category. I'm talking about specifically 3 releases: 12/5, Falling Home, and Linoleum. Linoleum is an EP that sort of preceded the Road Salt albums and gave, a very big hint of the kind of style. And in my opinion, the EP actually contains some of the better tracks. It contains an earlier version of Mortar Grind, which appeared on Road Salt 2, and an earlier version of Linoleum, which I believe appeared on Road Salt 1. And both of those tracks were re-recorded for the Road Salt albums, so they're presented a little bit differently on Linoleum. As well, there's the song If You Wait, which contains some themes that were seen on Road Salt 2, and the track Gone, which didn't appear on any of the other Road Salt albums. And it's a really good track. A really good track. Falling Home was the second most recent release from Pain of Salvation, and it's a bit of a weird album because, along with 12/5, though 12/5 was live and Falling Home was studio, where the band took more recent songs and rearranged them with acoustic instruments and to be more of a sort of acoustic, folky, ambient sort of sound. And I think that was a pretty good experimentation. Now, 12/5 is the same idea with other songs more from the Entropia, Perfect Element, and Remedy Lane era, done acoustically, this time live in front of an audience in their hometown. Really, really good live record. Kind of an interesting take on some of Pain of Salvation's songs. Next up on the list is Skaar Sick. Now, when Skaar Sick first came out, I wasn't really too sure what to think of this album, because it did have some really good songs, and then it had some tracks that kind of irked me a little. I think the band was going for a bit of a nu metal sort of ambiance with this record. More, drop-tuned, heavy-hitting, drop-A, 7-string riffs. More aggressive, visceral kind of vocals. It seems like a lot of the lyrics were just kind of a piss take on society. It's definitely their most angst-ridden record, and they have angst. This band knows angst. But Skaar Sick, they kind of took it in a bit of a weird direction that's a little bit more like, something like Rage Against the Machine or Korn, which is a bit weird for the band, especially considering that they have done very emotional lyrics in the past and very political lyrics in the past, but the way that they kind of melded them together on Skaar Sick was a little odd. There are a couple really good songs on this record, though. I remember when I first heard America, I must have played that song about 100 times, and Disco Queen is fun. It might be a little divisive among Pain of Salvation fans, but it is a fun song. And there's some other really good songs. Enter Rain is a total epic. Kingdom of Loss has some really beautiful parts. Crib Cage is probably the most beautiful song to contain more than 10 instances of the word fuck. There's some really good tracks on it, but it felt a little bit of a weak sort of album for me. Next up is Entropia. It feels a little weird to put one of the band's first 4 albums this low on the list, especially considering there are a couple far more recent albums higher on the list. But I felt that Entropia, it didn't really have the sophistication of future Pain of Salvation records. It feels a little primordial at times. There's some good songs, but then there are also just a couple of tracks that don't really feel like they belong there. Welcome to Entropia, Circles, Void of Her, a couple of musical interludes that don't really feel like they're really connected to anything, and the album's sort of cryptic concept doesn't really lend itself as well to this record. That said, this album does feature some of the band's most revered classics, like Exclamation Mark and Leaving Entropia Epilogue. That's a great tune, great way to close the album. People Passing By is a total epic, and I think I learned how to do slap guitar on that song, so great track. Next on the list is an album I almost feel kind of painful putting this low, because there was a time when this album was the be-all, end-all of records for me, and that is B. This album is probably one of the most pretentious, just overblown records that's ever been made by any artist, and the band will more than happily tell you that themselves. This album just goes all over the place with various influences from folk, Broadway show tunes, of course, the band's progressive metal style, church hymns. It's just all over the place. Classical music. But unlike a lot of other albums from other bands that sort of play off of about 1,000 different styles, B seems a little bit more cohesive, and it does have a very cool story to it. Although, like I said, it's a very pretentious one. I believe I heard something about it being like a contemporary creation myth. It doesn't get much more pretentious than that. And it does feature some of the best songs I've heard from the band, like Entropia and Lilium Cruentus, which are just mind-blowing songs. Vocari Dii, I don't know how to pronounce it, I don't speak Latin, is a really touching track. Some people might think it's really cheesy, but I think it's really great. So, B is there, but it has slipped. This album would have been number one like 5 years ago for me, but I've just been listening to more of their other stuff, and I really have to kind of give the band's other material better score than B. However, I would say the live DVD version of B is not just recommended, but like it's essential. In fact, I would go on record to say that B, the stage production DVD, is my all-time favorite music video release ever. So, B still is number one in that regard. Following that is 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake, which is coming in at 4th place. Now, a lot of people don't really care for 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. Some people say it's maybe a little too sterile, too typical Dream Theater-ish prog metal for their tastes, and I can feel where they're coming from with that. This album is a little bit more of a mechanical, industrial sort of record, and even the lyrical theme even reflects that, being a concept album about a man's journey from, the weapons industry to seeing how it's used to suppress indigenous peoples, nuclear waste, and I could go into more of it, but there was a time when this album really sort of formed my own personal opinions about the environment and politics. And musically speaking, there are some just tremendously good riffs on this record. In terms of just solid prog metal riffing, the guitar work on 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake is sublime. It is the best album from Pain of Salvation if you're a guitar player. And that may be where some people's view of 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake suffers a little, is if you're not a musician, you probably don't get where the polyrhythms are, and you probably don't get why these riffs are so unique. Even the band themselves have kind of distanced themselves a little from the record. I have it on record that Daniel Gildenlow does not really care much for the song Shore Serenity, and I don't really blame him. It's not the best Pain of Salvation song, but there are some really good songs on this record. Pilgrim, Home, Water, Inside. New Year's Eve is a concert staple for them. Just a really great album that I don't think gets the respect it deserves. third place, almost controversially, goes to the band's most recent album, In the Passing Light of Day. When I first heard this album, there were a few tracks I was a little skeptical of, but there were a few tracks that, after Road Salt 1 and Road Salt 2 had come out, I heard this and I'm like, this is a return to form. This is what a return to form feels like. And, yeah, In the Passing Light of Day has slipped in the same way as B, but in the opposite direction. I might have swapped those two albums in my list, like, 6 months ago, a year ago, but now it's one of my favorite Pain of Salvation records. The riffs on this one are almost like on the level of 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. There aren't really any traditional guitar solos on the record, just on Angels of Broken Things, but overall, for guitar players, there's a lot to like on this record. And it features some of the band's more progressive moments, and I think, maybe controversially, this is probably the first album where I feel the production was really nailed. I felt what the band was going for with the Road Salt albums by stripping down the sound and going for a bit more of an organic 70s prog feeling, but I felt like on Road Salt, they did that at the expense of the music. Whereas on In the Passing Light of Day, the band managed to do that without sacrificing the things that make Pain of Salvation, Pain of Salvation. It has that 70s production, especially in the drums. This is probably my favorite album in terms of drum sound that I've ever heard. And Leo Marguerite, absolutely killer drummer. When I saw the band in concert in February, I got to hang out with the band at the VIP meet and greet. I thought I was going to be like all, fanboying Daniel the whole time, but I ended up spending most of that VIP chatting it up with Leo and their bassist Gustav Helm, who actually used to play in the band before Entropia, then left, and it was Daniel's brother playing bass for a while, and then Simon Anderson, and they had a punch-up, and now it's Gustav playing bass, and I got a whole new respect for the band's rhythm section thanks to this album, and thanks to getting a chance to talk to them. Great album. At the number 2 spot is the album The Perfect Element Part 1. By power of elimination, you know what the number 1 album is if you're a Pain of Salvation fan, and to be perfectly honest, on any given day of the week I could swap these two albums places easily. Sometimes I'm more in the mood for Perfect Element, sometimes I'm more in the mood for my number 1 choice, but The Perfect Element Part 1, I think, right now maybe doesn't quite hold my attention the way Remedy Lane does, and I think that's really down to just the album has a little bit more length. There's a few tracks on Perfect Element that I don't connect with as easily as some of the fan base, like King of Loss. I never really got into that track. However, this does have some of the band's most emotionally gripping, yet also instrumentally enthralling pieces, like Her Voices, Idioglossia, In the Flesh. Really great songs. The guitar solo from Used is probably a high water mark for the band in terms of guitar solos. The title track is just probably the band's magnum opus. It's just an incredible ride from beginning to end, and it does have a few spots that maybe are a little weaker to me than to the rest of the fan base, but it's about as close to a perfect prog metal record as you're gonna get, save for the number 1 spot. And that number 1 spot goes to Remedy Lane. I could do a 20-minute video on this album alone, but this is one of those few records that's just completely perfect from start to finish. There isn't a moment on this record that feels cheesy, overblown, like it doesn't fit. This is just one of those absolutely brilliant albums that just defies what progressive metal is. I mean, you might go into this album expecting, like, Dream Theater-esque time signature changes and, you know, Opeth-style growls, and you're not going to get any of that, but what you are going to get are these beautifully constructed songs that do occasionally go off into, like, an instrumental tangent. Like, A Trace of Blood kind of has, like, a neat little solo section in it, and there are some moments on the record where, you know, you do start to get that sense of, like, the progressive metal, like, the 5/4 time signature of Fandango. You know, some of the riffs get really, really technical at times. I believe in Ropens there's actually, like, a bit of the solo that's in, like, 15/16 time because they can. But it never feels like the instrumental technicality overplays the songwriting. And I think that's an important thing in progressive music, is you can have songs that are these incredible technical challenges, but if there isn't a good melody or a good lyrical theme behind it, you're missing something. And this album has that perfect synergy of instrumental technicality and beautiful songwriting. A song like Undertow, which, if any other band had done this, it would come off as incredibly angsty and just melodramatic. Pain of Salvation manages to make this just one of the most heart-wrenching songs you'll ever hear. Like, by the time you're done listening to that song, you want to die as much as Daniel does. And, you know, this album actually ties in with In the Passing Light of Day, lyrically being about Daniel's own personal experiences with love and sex and relationships. In the Passing Light of Day, of course, takes that in the context of his bout with flesh-eating bacteria, his stay in a hospital bed, and reflecting over his life and his relationship with his wife in that sort of context, whereas Remedy Lane is, I don't really know the details, but I have this feeling that it's about a very open period in their relationship and the discovery of sexuality and stuff like that. And strangely, for a progressive metal record, this is an album that has an almost universal sort of lyrical appeal. So, yeah, these are just some incredibly written songs, and it's absolutely probably one of the best progressive metal albums of all time. There are days I would actually put this album over Scenes from a Memory, which is something to say for progressive metal, because Scenes is probably progressive metal's high-water benchmark. So, that was my ranking of Pain of Salvation albums from worst to best. And, surely there are going to be a few people that are going to disagree with some of the rankings of Pain of Salvation records. Frankly, if Daniel happens to watch this video, I'd be curious to know what his opinion on some of this is. But, these are just, all of their albums are just really great. I highly recommend checking this band out. Even the Road Salt albums, which I didn't personally connect with, but let's be frank, they're still really good records. And, you should check this band out. And, kudos to Notes Reviews for doing an amazing job, reviewing all sorts of great progressive music albums. You know, hey, you know, if I'm down in Toronto for a concert again, we should go grab a coffee or something and chat prog. That would be cool. Anyway, thanks for watching. Sorry that my fan is on in the background. It's hot up here. Take care.